The sounds of an army are unmistakable. The rhythmic beat of thousands of boots, the clinking of iron, the shared breath of a living machine. But what happens when that rhythm stops, when the march dissolves into the mist, and the only thing left is a silence so heavy it feels like a presence itself? We are moving deeper now away from the men and into the memory of where they once stood. If you're listening to my stories right now, I wonder, where in the world are you joining me from? Perhaps in the quiet of the night or amidst the rush of the day. Wherever you are welcome here. But before we step further into the shadows of this enigma, if you are a soul drawn to the whispers of the past and the mysteries the world forgot, you have found your sanctuary. Join our growing circle of seekers by subscribing to Dreamy Old Stories. Together, let us journey into the depths of history where the truth remains hidden and every story carries a secret. Welcome back. This is Dreamy Old Stories, and today we uncover a tale that was never meant to be told. Across the open stretch of land, there is no visible formation, no line of soldiers moving through the terrain, yet the ground seems to carry a suggestion of past movement. The surface holds faint irregularities, shallow compressions that hint at repeated pressure, though their pattern is incomplete. Grass grows unevenly in certain areas, bending slightly where it once may have been pressed down more often. The space appears empty, but not untouched, as if something has passed through in such a way that its presence has blended into the land rather than standing apart from it. The experience of listening in this place is shaped not by clear sound, but by the awareness of what feels just beyond hearing. The air carries a softness that absorbs sharper noise, leaving behind only the faintest impressions. At times, there is a subtle sense of rhythm not fully formed, like a distant echo that never becomes distinct. The ground seems to hold this impression more than the air, as if the memory of sound lingers beneath the surface rather than traveling outward. The ears do not capture a clear signal, yet there is a quiet sense that something once moved with steady cadence. A shift occurs when attention lingers, and the suggestion of rhythm begins to fade further, dissolving into the natural sounds of the environment. The faint impression of footsteps becomes less recognizable, blending into the movement of wind across grass or the soft settling of soil. What once might have been perceived as a pattern begins to lose its structure, breaking apart into smaller, unrelated sensations. The transition is gradual, not a sudden loss, but a gentle merging where the memory of sound becomes indistinguishable from the present atmosphere. There is a quiet reflection that emerges from this fading impression, where the absence of clear sound carries more weight than any defined noise could. The mind begins to consider how movement can leave behind something that is not fully tangible, a trace that exists between presence and disappearance. The idea of marching remains, not as something heard, but as something sensed in its absence. In this way, the land holds a subtle echo, one that does not repeat itself, but quietly suggests that something once moved here with purpose, now softened into memory. Across a slightly sloped stretch of ground, the terrain reveals gentle variations that seem to guide attention rather than movement. Narrow lines of flattened grass run unevenly through the field, not forming a path, but suggesting direction in fragments. Small stones rest in shallow depressions, their placement hinting at subtle disturbance rather than deliberate arrangement. The land does not display clear signs of passage, yet its surface feels shaped in ways that suggest repeated contact over time. These physical details do not confirm movement, but they offer a quiet structure that invites the thought of something once passing through. The experience of standing within this space brings a curious awareness of silence that feels layered rather than empty. The air carries faint textures of sound that are difficult to isolate, a distant brushing, a soft shifting, something that almost resembles a rhythm but never fully gathers into one. When listening closely, there is a sense of expectation, as if the ear anticipates a pattern that remains just out of reach. The body responds to this subtle tension, holding a quiet alertness, even though nothing distinct emerges from the surrounding atmosphere. As attention continues, the subtle impressions begin to reorganize, not into clarity, but into a softer form of perception. The suggestion of rhythm loosens, becoming less tied to the idea of footsteps and more connected to the natural movements within the environment. A passing breeze creates a gentle sequence through the grass, forming a temporary pattern that rises and fades. The ground shifts slightly under pressure, producing a faint response that echoes briefly before disappearing. These small changes replace the earlier sense of marching, transforming it into something more diffuse and less defined. Within this transition, a different kind of awareness begins to settle, one that no longer searches for a specific source of sound. The mind adjusts to the absence of clear rhythm, allowing the space to be understood without needing to resolve it into something familiar. The idea of distant marching remains present, but only as a quiet impression that does not require confirmation. In this way, the absence itself becomes something that can be noticed, a subtle presence that lingers without needing to take form, resting gently within the wider stillness of the land. Along a narrow stretch where the ground dips slightly, the surface reveals faint overlapping marks that seem to carry a layered history of contact. These impressions are not sharp or clearly defined, but they gather in ways that suggest repeated pressure over time. Some areas appear more compact, as if weight settled there more often, while others remain softer, holding only partial traces. The pattern does not form a clear sequence, yet it hints at movement passing through in intervals, leaving behind a subtle texture that blends into the natural shape of the land. The sensation of listening here becomes more inward, as if the ear begins to follow something that is not fully present in the air. There is a quiet awareness of timing, a sense that something once followed a steady pace, even though no sound now confirms it. The body responds with a faint echo of rhythm, not heard, but felt in a gentle anticipation. The atmosphere seems to carry a soft pressure, like a memory that has settled into the space, creating a feeling that something structured once moved through, even if its sound can no longer be separated from the silence. A gradual shift occurs as attention moves across these overlapping traces, and the sense of rhythm becomes more fragmented. The imagined sequence of steps begins to break apart, no longer forming a continuous pattern. Instead, small and unrelated sounds take its place, a distant rustle, a faint shift of ground, a brief whisper of wind. These elements do not connect into a single movement, but exist independently, each rising and fading without forming a larger structure. The earlier impression of marching dissolves further, replaced by a series of quieter, unconnected moments. Within this soft fragmentation, there is a growing understanding that the presence of sound does not always remain in its original form. What once may have been clear and steady becomes diffused, carried into the environment in ways that are no longer direct. The mind begins to rest in this transition, recognizing that absence is not emptiness, but a different kind of presence. The distant marching is no longer something to be heard, but something that lingers as a quiet impression, held gently within the shifting textures of the land. Along a flatter stretch of terrain, The surface appears smoother, with fewer visible impressions. Yet there are subtle variations in color and density that suggest a quiet layering of past contact. The soil shifts from lighter tones to darker patches where pressure may have once gathered more deeply. Small clusters of grass grow in uneven patterns, leaving thin gaps between them that hint at earlier disturbance. There are no clear marks to follow, but the ground carries a faint suggestion of alignment, as if something once moved across it in repeated intervals, leaving behind a softened trace that has blended into the wider landscape. The experience of being present in this space brings a different kind of listening, one that feels less directed and more dispersed. Sounds do not arrive as distinct points, but as a gentle spread of quiet tones that seem to exist just beneath awareness. There is a soft hum in the air, not a true sound, but a sensation that lingers as if the space itself holds a memory of vibration. The body becomes aware of its own stillness in contrast to this subtle presence, noticing the quiet rhythm of breathing and the faint contact of feet with the ground. A gradual change unfolds as attention shifts from the idea of distant marching toward the immediate environment. The faint alignment in the ground becomes less noticeable, replaced by the natural irregularities of the terrain. Small movements begin to take focus, the bending of grass under a passing breeze, the slight settling of soil after pressure is applied. These changes do not form a pattern, but they create a sense of ongoing activity that replaces the earlier impression of structured movement. The idea of marching recedes further, dissolving into the present flow of subtle motion. Within this transition, there is a quiet realization that the memory of sound does not remain fixed in place, but disperses into the environment in ways that are difficult to trace. The sense of distant marching becomes less about recalling a specific rhythm and more about recognizing how presence can fade into the surrounding space. The land does not hold the sound in a clear form, but it carries a gentle impression of something that once moved through it. This impression remains without clarity, allowing the mind to rest within the quiet space between memory and absence. Across a wider clearing, the ground opens into a more even surface, where fewer interruptions draw attention, and the space feels gently extended in all directions. There are no visible traces of concentrated movement here, yet the soil carries a faint smoothness, as if it has been pressed over time in ways that are no longer distinct. The edges of the clearing blend gradually into surrounding terrain, with no sharp boundary to separate one area from another. The openness allows the eye to move freely across the space, yet it offers no clear point to rest upon. The sensation of listening in this open area feels lighter, almost as if the air has expanded to hold less density. Sounds, when they arise, seem to travel briefly before dissolving into the wider space. There is a faint impression of distance within even the smallest noise, a quality that stretches each sound slightly before it fades. The body senses this openness not through what is heard, but through how quickly each sound disappears, leaving behind a soft, lingering quiet that feels broader than before. A subtle change begins to emerge as the absence of defined sound becomes more noticeable than any suggestion of rhythm. The earlier impressions of distant marching no longer return, even faintly, replaced instead by the quiet flow of natural elements moving through the clearing. A passing shift in the air creates a brief ripple across the surface, then fades without forming pattern. The space does not hold onto these moments, allowing each to pass through without leaving a lasting trace. There is a gentle realization within this openness that the idea of sound has fully transitioned into absence, not as something lost, but as something that has become part of the wider environment. The memory of marching no longer seeks to be recognized, but rests quietly within the space itself. The mind no longer listens for it, but acknowledges its quiet departure, understanding that what once carried rhythm has now settled into a broader, more subtle presence that no longer needs to be heard. At the farthest reach of the clearing, the ground begins to gather small irregularities again, where the smooth surface gives way to patches of uneven soil and scattered growth. The transition is gradual, marked by slight changes in texture rather than clear boundaries. Thin lines of grass rise at different heights, and the earth shows faint disruptions where water may have moved through at some earlier time. There are no visible signs of passage here, only a surface that feels shaped by many quiet influences, none of which stand out enough to define what has come before. The experience of listening in this space settles into something softer and more diffuse, where the absence of sound no longer feels noticeable. The air carries a gentle neutrality, neither holding nor suggesting anything beyond what is immediately present. Breathing becomes more prominent in awareness, not because it changes, but because there is little else to draw attention away from it. The ground underfoot offers a muted response with each step, blending into the surrounding quiet in a way that feels complete rather than empty. A small shift occurs as attention moves away from listening altogether, no longer searching for any trace of rhythm or memory. The senses begin to rest more fully in the present, noticing only what arises naturally: the slight movement of grass, the soft variation of light across the ground, the subtle change in air as it passes. These elements do not connect into a pattern, nor do they replace what has faded. Instead, they form a quiet continuity that carries forward without reference to what came before. In this final transition, there is a quiet understanding that the sound of distant marching has fully dissolved into the wider experience of the landscape. It no longer lingers as an impression or suggestion, but has become part of the past in a way that no longer seeks recognition. What remains is not an echo, but a space where something once existed and has now gently receded. The mind rests in this absence without questioning it, allowing the quiet to hold its own presence, complete in its own subtle and unspoken way. A march that no longer makes a sound, an echo that refuses to fade. But it isn't just the absence of noise that haunts these hills. It is the very air they breathe. The northern climate, a cold, damp shroud that doesn't just surround the land, it consumes it. And it is within this suffocating moisture that the trail of the ninth begins to grow cold. The northern landscape unfolds under a wide, muted sky that hangs lower than expected, pressing gently over the uneven terrain. Clouds gather in soft layers, not sharply defined, but spread across the horizon in pale gray tones that shift subtly with time. The ground below carries a darker color, saturated by moisture that settles deeply into the soil. Patches of grass grow in irregular clusters, their blades bending slightly under the weight of dampness. Shallow pools form in natural depressions, reflecting the sky above and blurred, quiet surfaces that seem to merge with the land itself. The air carries a cool, steady presence that settles gradually against the skin, not sharp enough to startle, but constant enough to be noticed over time. Moisture lingers within each breath, creating a faint heaviness that moves in and out with quiet regularity. Clothing gathers a slight dampness that never fully fades, holding onto the atmosphere rather than resisting it. The scent of wet earth rises gently from the ground, blending with the soft, almost neutral quality of the air. Every sensation feels slightly softened, as if filtered through a thin layer of moisture that rests across everything. A subtle change begins to reveal itself as the day progresses, not through sudden shifts, but through small adjustments in light and temperature. The clouds drift slowly, opening in places to allow a dim brightness to pass through before closing again. The ground responds to these changes in quiet ways, surfaces appearing slightly lighter for a time before returning to deeper tones. Water gathers and recedes in shallow areas, influenced by the gentle movement of air and the slow settling of the soil. These changes do not transform the landscape, but they alter its details in ways that can be noticed with careful attention. There is a quiet awareness that forms within this environment, where the passage of time feels stretched and softened by the consistent presence of moisture and cloud. The climate does not demand attention, but it shapes experience in a steady, persistent way. The mind begins to adjust to this rhythm, recognizing how the air, the ground, and the sky work together to create a space that feels continuous rather than divided into clear moments. In this way, the environment becomes something that is not simply observed, but gradually understood through quiet, ongoing presence. Across the wider stretch of land, the surface reveals subtle layers shaped by long exposure to moisture, where the soil appears slightly uneven, rising and sinking in shallow forms that are not immediately noticeable. Thin channels run through the ground, guiding water in quiet directions that shift over time. Stones rest partially embedded, their edges softened, their surfaces darkened by repeated contact with damp air. Grass grows in denser patches where the ground holds more water, while other areas remain sparse, creating a natural variation that spreads gently across the landscape without forming clear divisions. The sensation of being within this climate deepens as the body begins to register the constant presence of dampness in more subtle ways. The air feels closer, almost pressing lightly against the skin, not through force, but through its steady contact. Moisture gathers along the surface of objects, forming a thin layer that cools the touch. Breathing carries a quiet weight, as if each inhale brings in more than air alone. Even the smallest movement creates a faint shift in sensation, as the surrounding atmosphere responds gently, maintaining its soft and steady influence. A gradual shift emerges as the temperature fluctuates slightly, not enough to alter the overall feeling, but enough to introduce a quiet variation. The air grows marginally cooler as clouds thicken, then softens again when lighter patches appear above. The ground responds slowly, holding on to the previous state before adjusting, creating a brief overlap where changes can be felt but not clearly seen. Water settles into new shapes, expanding in some areas while retreating in others, reflecting these subtle shifts in ways that unfold over time. Within this slow movement of climate, there is a growing sense that the environment shapes experience through persistence rather than intensity. The changes are not dramatic, yet they carry a steady influence that becomes more noticeable through continued presence. The mind begins to settle into this pattern, recognizing how each small adjustment contributes to a larger continuity. In this way, the climate feels less like a series of conditions and more like an ongoing process, gently shaping everything within it through quiet and consistent presence. Across a lower stretch of ground, the surface appears darker and more saturated, where water has gathered more fully and settled into the soil over long periods. The land here feels heavier in appearance, with fewer dry patches breaking through the damp surface. Small pools form irregular shapes, their edges blending softly into the surrounding earth rather than holding a clear boundary. Grass grows shorter and closer to the ground, its color deepened by constant moisture. Stones seem more embedded here, as if the ground has slowly drawn them inward, holding them in place with quiet persistence. The sensation within this heavier area carries a different quality, where the air feels more dense and close to the ground. Each breath draws in a cooler, slightly thicker presence, not uncomfortable, but noticeable in its depth. The scent of wet soil becomes more pronounced, rising gently but steadily, creating a grounded atmosphere that surrounds the senses. The body responds with slower movements, not by intention, but through the subtle influence of the environment, where each step feels more connected to the surface beneath it. A quiet shift begins as the moisture within the ground interacts with passing conditions, creating small variations in how the surface responds. Certain areas hold water more firmly, while others begin to release it slowly, allowing the top layer to firm slightly before softening again. The change is gradual, unfolding over time rather than in sudden moments. Light plays across these surfaces, revealing slight differences in texture that appear and fade depending on the angle and intensity. These adjustments create a gentle rhythm within the land itself. There is a growing awareness that this climate shapes not only the appearance of the land, but the pace at which it is experienced. The environment encourages a slower form of attention, where details reveal themselves gradually rather than all at once. The mind begins to move in alignment with this pace, observing without expectation, allowing each subtle change to settle before the next emerges. In this way, the climate becomes more than a condition. It becomes a quiet influence that guides how the land is understood over time. Along the slightly elevated ridges, the surface takes on a different character, where the ground appears less saturated, yet still carries a quiet dampness beneath its outer layer. The soil is lighter in tone here, though not dry, with small cracks that do not deepen but remain shallow and soft at the edges. Grass grows taller in these raised areas, its blades moving more freely, catching the faint shifts of air that pass over the ridge. Scattered stones sit more exposed, their surfaces marked by subtle discoloration, suggesting long contact with moisture that has come and gone in quiet cycles. The sensation within this elevated space feels more open, where the air moves with slightly greater ease across the body. There is a faint coolness that touches the skin in passing, not constant, but arriving in gentle intervals. The moisture in the air feels lighter here, less settled, allowing each breath to feel more distinct. The scent of the ground is present, though softer, blending with a cleaner quality that seems to rise with a slight increase in elevation. The body senses a quiet variation, a shift that does not break the continuity of the climate, but adds a subtle difference in how it is experienced. A gradual change becomes noticeable as the movement of air interacts more directly with the surface of the ridge. Grass bends and lifts in uneven patterns, responding to currents that pass through without forming a steady direction. The ground, while firmer, still carries traces of moisture that respond slowly, darkening slightly in certain areas before returning to a lighter tone. These small adjustments unfold continuously, creating a gentle interplay between air and earth that shapes the ridge without altering its overall form. There is a quiet realization that even within a climate defined by dampness and cloud, there are layers of variation that reveal themselves through careful attention. The differences are not sharp or contrasting, but they offer a sense of depth within the environment, where each area carries its own subtle expression of the same conditions. The mind begins to notice how these variations contribute to a broader understanding of the land, where the climate is not a single experience, but a collection of quiet differences that exist together in a steady and continuous way. Along the shallow edges, where land meets small pools of collected water, the surface takes on a reflective quality that shifts with the slightest change in light. These pools are not deep, yet they spread outward in thin layers, creating irregular shapes that follow the natural contours of the ground. The edges blur gently, where water and soil meet without a clear boundary. Small clusters of grass emerge through the surface in places, their blades partially submerged, bending slightly as the water settles around them. The entire area appears shaped by a quiet accumulation rather than any sudden formation. The sensation near these waterlogged edges carries a cooler, more immediate presence, where the air feels closer to the surface and slightly heavier with moisture. A faint chill rises from the ground, meeting the skin with a softness that lingers. The scent here deepens, carrying a stronger impression of wet earth mixed with a subtle stillness of standing water. Each breath feels fuller, drawing in this layered atmosphere that surrounds the pools. The body becomes more aware of its contact with the ground, sensing the slight give beneath each step. A small shift becomes visible as the surface of the water responds to passing changes in air and light. Gentle ripples form and fade, altering the reflection of the sky in quiet motion. At times, the water recedes slightly, revealing darker soil beneath, only to gather again as conditions shift. Grass at the edges leans and straightens in response, creating a subtle interaction between land and water that unfolds continuously. These movements are delicate, yet they shape the appearance of the area in ways that can be noticed over time. There is a quiet sense that these water edges hold a balance between presence and change, where nothing remains fixed, yet nothing feels unsettled. The climate expresses itself here through this ongoing interaction, where moisture gathers, shifts, and settles again. The mind begins to recognize how this process reflects the larger nature of the environment, where persistence is expressed through gentle cycles rather than abrupt transformation. In observing this, there is a calm understanding that the landscape is shaped not by force, but by the quiet continuity of these subtle and repeated interactions. Toward the outer reaches of this region, the land begins to rise and fall in longer, quieter waves, where the influence of moisture reveals itself through subtle contrasts in color and texture. Some areas appear slightly lighter, where the surface has held less water, while others deepen into darker tones, indicating longer contact with dampness. The transitions are gradual, blending into one another without sharp division. Sparse vegetation stretches across these rolling forms, its growth shaped by the steady presence of the climate, creating a landscape that feels gently molded rather than sharply defined. The experience of this wider terrain carries a softened awareness of temperature and air, where the coolness remains present but less concentrated in any single place. The atmosphere feels evenly distributed, touching the skin with a consistent, quiet presence. There is a faint openness in the air here, where movement is less restricted, allowing each breath to feel slightly more expansive. The scent of the land becomes lighter again, no longer centered in one area, but spread thinly across the space, rising and fading in a slow, continuous rhythm. A gradual transition unfolds as the land responds to the ongoing cycle of moisture and light, creating small variations that extend across these rolling forms. Certain patches dry slightly before becoming damp again, while others retain their darker tone for longer periods. The interplay between these areas creates a shifting pattern that is never fixed, yet never abrupt. Grass adjusts its form in response, bending or standing more upright depending on the subtle conditions beneath it, reflecting the ongoing influence of the climate in quiet, visible ways. There is a deeper awareness that settles across this broader landscape, where the climate is no longer felt as a specific condition, but as a continuous presence that shapes everything it touches. The distinctions between wet and dry, cool and slightly less cool, begin to feel less important than the overall sense of continuity. The mind rests within this understanding, recognizing that the environment does not define itself through extremes, but through its steady influence over time. In this way, the northern climate reveals itself not through dramatic change, but through the quiet persistence that gently shapes the land and everything within it. Water and earth, merging into one, under this gray, oppressive sky, even the most disciplined formation eventually seeks shelter. But as we find the remnants of their camps, we find something unsettling. The structures remain. The paths are still there, but the life that once filled them has vanished, leaving behind only the cold ash of a fire that died centuries ago. The outlines of the camp remain visible across the ground, marked by faint geometric order that once guided movement and placement. Rectangular spaces suggest where tents once stood, their positions aligned with careful intention. Narrow pathways run between these areas, lightly worn into the soil, their direction still clear even without footsteps to follow them. At the center, a fire pit rests as a shallow circle of darkened earth, bordered by stones that have shifted slightly but still hold their form. The arrangement feels deliberate, each section connected within a larger design that continues to define the space. The experience of entering this space carries a quiet awareness of absence that is felt more than observed. The air seems to hold a softness that settles gently around the body, as if sound itself has been lowered. There is a faint dryness near the fire pit, where the scent of ash lingers lightly, blending with the cooler air that surrounds it. The ground beneath each step feels firm in some places and slightly uneven in others, guiding movement in subtle ways. The senses adjust to this environment slowly, recognizing that what is missing shapes the experience as much as what remains. A subtle shift becomes noticeable as attention moves along the pathways, where small details reveal themselves gradually. Grass begins to edge into the lines where feet once passed, softening the boundaries of these routes. Loose soil gathers in shallow depressions, altering the surface without removing the original form. Stones that once marked corners or edges lean slightly, their positions adjusted by time and quiet influence. These changes do not disrupt the structure, but they introduce a gentle transformation that continues without drawing attention to itself. There is a quiet reflection that forms within this ordered emptiness, where the absence of activity allows the structure itself to become more visible. Without movement to define its purpose, the camp reveals its design more clearly, as if it has been left behind for observation rather than use. The silence here is not sudden or imposed, but something that has settled gradually, filling the space where voices and motion once existed. In this way, the camp holds both presence and absence together, offering a quiet sense of what remains when activity has slowly faded away. Along the outer edge of encampment, the boundary is marked by a shallow ditch and a low rise of earth, forming a faint perimeter that once separated the interior from the surrounding land. The ditch is no longer sharp, its edges softened by time, while the raised bank appears uneven in height, shaped by gradual settling. Small gaps appear where the line breaks slightly, suggesting entrances that once guided movement in and out. Within this boundary, The layout remains visible, its structure holding together despite the quiet changes that have begun to reshape its finer details. The sensation of moving along this perimeter carries a different awareness, where the openness beyond the camp contrasts gently with the contained space within. The air feels slightly more exposed here, brushing more directly across the skin, while the scent of the interior lingers faintly behind. There is a subtle difference in sound, where the quiet within the camp meets the softer, more dispersed tones of the surrounding land. The body senses this transition not through clear division, but through a gradual blending of atmosphere that shifts as one moves between spaces. A quiet change unfolds as the boundary interacts with the land around it, where grass begins to grow more freely along the edges, softening the line that once defined separation. The ditch gathers small amounts of soil, reducing its depth, while the raised bank settles unevenly, lowering in some places more than others. These changes do not erase the boundary, but they alter how it is perceived, making it less distinct while still present. The perimeter becomes something that is felt rather than clearly seen, a suggestion of structure rather than a firm division. There is a quiet understanding that emerges from this softened boundary, where the idea of separation begins to lose its clarity. The camp no longer feels entirely enclosed nor fully open, but something in between, where the distinction between inside and outside becomes less certain. The silence extends beyond the camp itself, blending into the wider landscape, allowing the space to feel less defined by its borders. In this way, the camp becomes part of the land around it, its structure still present, yet gently merging into the quiet continuity that surrounds it. Within the intersections of the camp, smaller arrangements begin to appear, where objects once placed with intention have left behind subtle indications of their former position. Low mounds of earth suggest where supplies may have been gathered, their shapes uneven but contained within a recognizable area. Stones form partial outlines, not complete circles or lines, but enough to hint at boundaries that once organized activity. The ground shows slight variations in tone, darker in some patches, lighter in others, creating a quiet pattern that reflects earlier use without fully revealing its purpose. The experience of standing among these inner spaces carries a sense of closeness, where the surroundings feel more contained than at the outer edge. The air seems to settle differently here, holding a faint warmth near the ground, as if it has been sheltered within the camp's structure. There is a subtle layering of scent, traces of ash, earth, and something older, blending into a quiet atmosphere that feels gathered rather than dispersed. Each small movement produces a soft response from the ground, a muted shift that seems to stay close rather than spreading outward. A gradual change becomes noticeable as attention moves through these inner areas, where the shapes left behind begin to soften at their edges. Grass slowly grows into spaces that were once kept clear, altering the outlines of these subtle formations. Loose soil shifts into shallow depressions, filling in areas that once held more defined forms. The arrangement begins to lose its sharpness, not disappearing, but blending into the natural texture of the ground, creating a quieter and less distinct pattern over time. There is a quiet reflection that forms in observing these inner traces, where the absence of activity reveals the structure in a different way. Without movement to define purpose, the shapes become open to interpretation, offering only partial suggestions of what once occurred. The mind does not seek to reconstruct the full picture, but rests within the fragments that remain. In this way, the silence allows the camp to be experienced not as a place of action, but as a space where meaning has softened, leaving behind only a quiet impression of order that lingers without explanation. Near the central area, the fire pit forms a shallow hollow where the soil carries a darker tone, surrounded by a loose ring of stones that lean at slight angles. Some stones rest firmly, while others appear shifted, their edges no longer aligned as they may once have been. Around the center, the ground shows faint circular patterns, areas where movement may have gathered more frequently. The surface feels slightly compacted, though softened by time, creating a subtle distinction between this central space and the more open areas beyond it. The experience of standing near the fire pit brings a different quality of awareness, where the atmosphere feels closer and more contained. There is a faint dryness in the air here, a contrast to the surrounding dampness, as if the ground holds a memory of heat that has long since faded. The scent of ash lingers lightly, not strong, but present enough to be noticed with quiet attention. The body senses a gentle stillness in this area, not from the absence of movement alone, but from the way the space seems to hold itself together. A subtle shift occurs as light moves across the fire pit, revealing variations in the surface that change with each passing moment. The darker soil reflects less light, while the surrounding stones catch faint highlights that shift as the angle changes. Small particles of dust lift slightly when disturbed, then settle again, altering the appearance in quiet ways. These changes are not dramatic, yet they bring a sense of quiet activity to the space, as if the environment continues to interact with what remains. There is a quiet reflection that forms around this central point, where the absence of fire becomes more noticeable than its former presence. The space suggests gathering, warmth, and shared attention, yet none of these remain in a visible form. What is left is a quiet center that no longer draws movement, but still holds a sense of focus within the camp. The mind begins to recognize how a place can retain its meaning even after its function has faded, carrying a quiet impression of what once brought people together. Along the narrow pathways that connect one section of the camp to another, the ground reveals faint lines where repeated movement once shaped the surface. These paths curve gently between the rectangular spaces, not perfectly straight, but guided by practical use. The soil appears slightly more compact along these routes, forming shallow tracks that differ subtly from the surrounding ground. Small stones sit along the edges, some pressed deeper into the earth, others resting lightly. The pathways remain visible, though softened, creating a quiet network that still holds the memory of connection between different parts of the camp. The experience of following these paths carries a quiet sense of direction, even in the absence of activity. The ground beneath the feet feels more stable along these lines, guiding each step with a subtle firmness. There is a faint difference in texture, where the surface responds more evenly to pressure. The air seems to settle differently along these routes, as if shaped by the openness they once provided. Movement along these paths feels natural, not because they are clearly defined, but because the body senses their quiet continuity. A gradual change becomes noticeable as the pathways begin to soften further under the influence of time. Grass starts to grow across them in thin strands, interrupting the lines that once remained clear. Soil shifts slightly, filling in shallow depressions, reducing the contrast between path and surrounding ground. The edges blur gently, making the routes less distinct while still traceable. These changes do not erase the pathways, but they alter how they appear, transforming them into quieter suggestions rather than clear guides. There is a quiet understanding that forms while moving along these fading paths, where the idea of connection begins to change. The routes no longer serve to guide movement between active spaces, yet they continue to link parts of the camp in a quieter way. The mind begins to notice how these paths carry a sense of relation without requiring use, holding a subtle memory of movement that once flowed through them. In this way, the pathways remain present, not as directions to follow, but as gentle traces of how the camp once held its shape through motion. Toward the quieter corners of the camp, the arrangement becomes less defined, where the edges of order begin to soften into the surrounding ground. The rectangular outlines of spaces grow less distinct, their corners rounded by gradual settling and the slow spread of grass. Small gaps appear where the structure seems to loosen, allowing the natural contours of the land to press inward. Here, the signs of deliberate placement are lighter, blending with the uneven surface, so that the distinction between arranged space and open ground becomes more subtle and less certain. The experience within these outer corners carries a lighter, more dispersed awareness, where the sense of enclosure fades into a broader openness. The air moves more freely, carrying a softer mix of scents that no longer gather in one place. The ground feels less compact beneath the feet, responding with a gentler give that reflects the reduced pressure it has held over time. Sounds, when they occur, seem to travel further before fading, as if the space no longer contains them in the same quiet way as the inner areas. A gradual transition unfolds as these outer sections continue to blend into the surrounding land, where the remaining traces of structure become less prominent with each subtle change. Grass extends further into the spaces, covering parts of the ground that once remained clear. Stones shift slightly, losing their alignment and becoming part of the natural scatter of the terrain. The transformation is slow and continuous, shaping the camp into something less defined while still holding faint echoes of its original form. There's a quiet realization that emerges in these fading edges, where the idea of the camp as a separate place begins to dissolve. The structure does not disappear, but it becomes less distinct, merging gently with the wider landscape. The silence that fills this space feels complete, not because it replaces what was there, but because it has settled over time, becoming part of the environment itself. In this way, the camp remains present, not as a place of activity, but as a quiet impression that continues to exist within the land. Geometry in the mud, rectangles of order in a world of chaos. The camp is perfect, yet it is empty. No signs of a struggle, no scattered weapons of a final stand. It's as if 5,000 men simply stepped out of their tents and walked into the air itself. But as we look closer at the central fire pit, we realize something we missed. The silence of the camp isn't just empty space. It's a warning, and the final revelation is waiting just beyond the next ridge. The mist is thickening, and we are not alone.